Welcome Robert, Wayne, and Maida. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be moderating this roundtable today. Thank you, Wayne and Bob, for joining us today. I just want to remind you of the title of the session, which is How to Reach Excellence and Equity in Education in a Data-Driven World. So before we start, I'd love to get a feeling from you of how do you understand and how do you interpret equity and excellence in your own words? So Wayne, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's good to be part of this discussion. Thank you. For me, I want to start with what excellence is not. So excellence in education, for me, it's not about young people learning facts and procedures. It's not about passing exams. It's not about doing things that are kind of easily quantifiable. But for me, it's all about helping young people to fully develop their individual potential so that they can live a fulfilling life and make a positive contribution to society. So that's what it's about for me. And to achieve that, I think young people, they need high quality learning opportunities. They need professional teachers, opportunities to meet and collaborate with other students and to discover things and consolidate what they've learned. So I think it's a complex mix of things, but and really important. But then in terms of equity, there it's very much about the outcomes. It's about what the young people can achieve. And it's a recognition that in order for all young people to achieve their full potential, equal opportunities are not enough. If we just give equal opportunities to all our young people, that does not mean that all young people will achieve what they can achieve. Particularly children from lower socioeconomic situations or developing countries or rural areas or students with disabilities. These young people, they need extra support and extra work on our behalf so that they can achieve what they're capable of achieving.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree with Wayne more. I mean, excellence is not how well you've done on a test. It's not your grade. It's not how well you can do on standardized exams. In fact, it's those things that are really difficult to measure. It's things like Wayne talked about, but also curiosity, inspiration, connections with other individuals, being inspired by teachers, being supported by your parents, working together with your peers. It is about opportunities to grow. The concept of growth mindset I like, in the sense that there aren't limitations in what students can do to achieve excellence. It's about agency. It's about defining your own terms of excellence. But it's also around struggle. It's also around failure. And it's also around perseverance. And these things are very difficult to measure. In terms of equity, it is providing these types of opportunities, this type of environment, these types of human connections to all students, and encouraging them to be able to strive to be the best they can be and to be different versions of themselves as well throughout their entire life. That failure does not define you. Failure helps you to identify future paths to grow as an individual, as a student, as a citizen of this world.
That's great. And actually, before the pandemic outbreak, we were already living a sort of learning crisis, right? With a huge gap in terms of equity in education. The way the World Bank actually estimates the levels of education in a country is by measuring how well a 10-year-old can read and understand a short paragraph, right? And so the numbers at the moment show that in low and middle income countries, just over half of 10-year-olds are unable of reading and properly understanding a short paragraph. And this can go up to 80% in some of the poorest countries, right? There are about 258 million students out of school at the moment, and this obviously gets worse in countries in conflict or some of the poorest countries in the world. So here, it'd be interesting to know, and we want to talk about how can technology help bridge this gap? And more specifically, how can technology help us guide us into decision-making for long-term impact in education? And here, Bob, you coordinated a paper with 5 principles that so recommendations on the use of ed tech in education. Could you briefly summarize those principles for us?
No, absolutely. I mean, as a result of COVID, with all the school closures, we've been inundated with demand for ways to use technology for remote distance learning to reach those kids that are out of school, which opened up huge divides in terms of access, in terms of skills, and all of the equity issues that we talked about. In response to clients and ministries of education that want to use ed tech to improve teaching and learning, we use these 5 principles. And the first one is always ask why. What is the change that you want to see as a result of this investment? How are the skills of students going to be changed? What will be the dynamic between teacher and student that you hope to achieve? How will the curriculum be more enriched through these investments? So being very specific on having education and educational outcomes and change in the classroom lead the decision to invest in ed tech as opposed to the technology. That's principle 1. The second one is for all at scale. Our belief is that if you focus on the most marginalized, the least connected, and you develop solutions to reach those individuals, those schools, those teachers, those students, you will be able to then scale up in the more socioeconomically rich areas of a country. So kind of working outward and in. The other aspect of this principle is the idea of human-centered design, that ministries of education need to take the time to really understand how the investments impact and respond to the needs of teachers and students. The third principle is empower teachers. At the end of the day, education is a social endeavor, and teachers are at the center of that engagement. And we need to find ways in which to support teachers to do what they do best in terms of inspiring students, helping them with their challenges, and not just delivering the curriculum, not just kind of marking exams. And this is an area that's, of potential of looking at ways that technology can maybe take away some of that administrative burden and empower teachers to do things differently, as well as looking at ways in which to connect teachers to other sources of information, other networks, other teachers. So again, looking at ways that technology can really empower teachers to do their job most effectively. The fourth principle is to engage the ecosystem. We recognize that ed tech is a multifaceted endeavor, that there are many linkages. You can't just procure tablets and expect magic to happen. But by the same token, you need to identify kind of what are those sources of expertise in your country, in your region, and to encourage ministries of education to engage with those sources of innovation, whether it's universities, whether it's private sector solution providers, whether it's NGOs, or in other parts of the government. For instance, working with the Ministry of Telecommunications on zero rating for content is kind of one example of working across ministries. So looking at kind of the broad ecosystem and being able to leverage that as a network to support education. And then finally, the fifth principle is be data-driven, that there's great opportunities to more effectively use data to not just measure impact at the system level, but also for learning analytics, learning outcomes, and looking at trying to, while previously I said that these, most of the important aspects of excellence are hard to measure, there are still opportunities to look at how we might begin to measure some of these 21st century skills, for example. But also the idea of using data, using evidence globally, is helping ministries not to reinvent the wheel, to engage with that broader ecosystem globally, and also to be iterative in their approach, and for Ministry of Education to be learning organizations, to continually attempt new interventions, gather the data on those interventions, and adapt their implementation.
And on that last point, exactly, of being data-driven and how that can be useful in policy making. Wayne, you've contributed to a document, a series of recommendations also on the use of artificial intelligence in education for policymakers. So what is the role of AI in education?
I mean, that is a huge area to begin with. And the reality is that AI is being used increasingly in education in a variety of different ways. The way I think of it is there's actually three different levels we can think of, or three different operations. One is what I refer to as learning with AI. So it's the use of AI tools to support teaching and learning. And that can be divided itself into system-facing, student-facing, teacher-facing. The next area is learning about AI. So learning how AI works, how to create it. And I'm not just talking about universities here, I'm talking about young children right the way through, having opportunities. And the third area, huge overlap with what I've already said, but this is about preparing for the fact that we are living in a world which is increasingly dominated by AI. And so what are the different implications? What are the social risks? What are the benefits? How do we ensure that AI serves humanity? So with all of these things, there genuinely are, risks and benefits. And But unfortunately, I would suggest at the moment, despite all the hyperbole that we have about how AI is going to transform education, I've read that so many times. At the moment, the benefits are still pretty unclear. There are really very few independent evaluations of the AI tools that exist. So which ones work, how they work, do they work, what do they achieve, is hugely, it's still a big open question. And yet policymakers around the world are jumping headfirst into buying up these systems, spending lots of money on them with very little evidence for their efficacy. But not just their efficacy, I mean, to return to what Bob was mentioning with those hard to measure things. AI is pretty poor, or at least the current versions that we see, they're pretty poor at helping young people to develop those skills. Where they're much more focused is on things like mathematics or physics, things that are very clearly delineated, that the AI can work out, well, this is a right answer, this is a wrong answer, and so on and so forth. But that's leading to education becoming much narrower rather than taking the opportunities to make education broader, to consider some of these wider things. And from what Bob was saying about the 5 principles, the first 4 absolutely 100% behind. I think they're really good and really important. The 5th one, I understand the ambition, but I'm not convinced. I think the problem is that the data that we currently have is incredibly limited. What's available is very specific. It's either high-level stuff, things like how many students go to school, student-teacher ratios in the classroom, what the examination results are for these very limited things. But it doesn't go further than that. And when it does, it's often proxies, and the proxies themselves can be quite weak. So, for example, it's very important to understand the impact of lower socioeconomic based young people in the education system. But the problem is we don't have real measures for that. We have proxies for that. And sometimes the proxies can be useful and accurate, but very often they're not. And that can send us off in the wrong direction. But we also have, using some of the electronic systems, the e-learning systems and the AI systems, we do get some individual interaction data. So we've got the high-level group data, and we've got the individual interaction data. But the problem with that data, the individual interaction data, is it's incredibly fragmented. Every system curates different data, collects different data, makes different decisions based on that data. It's non-standardized. And the other core thing is it's really focused on what the young person does when using that digital tool. So it doesn't take account of reading a book, having a conversation with a teacher, collaborating on a project with your peers, all those much more important things, in my view, just get missed. And so then when we say, and I do understand the logic that we need evidence in order to improve our education system, and I completely agree with that. But my problem is when we say, well, what is that evidence? And too much of the evidence at the moment is this very limited high-level data or very limited interaction data and not much else. And I've seen situations where we have systems, a classic one, we can log when somebody logs into an online system. We can also record when they log out. We can do a calculation from one to the other. So we have a duration of login time, which is fantastic. And then that's just one of multiple different bits of data we can collect. But the problem is then what happens with that information. Firstly, it doesn't cover me when I walk away from the screen or when I flip across to Facebook. So it's not really accurate in what I'm doing. And secondly, when we finish doing that, we then have to give it a variable name. And so what happens is we call that engagement. We'll do that for now. We'll call it engagement. And that's fair enough. The guys and people who are doing this, that's fair enough. They need to give it a name. But then you only have to wait 5 or 6 weeks. And people forget that what they're talking about is not engagement. It's actually the difference between a login and a log out time. But then we see these big pronouncements about, well, by doing X, Y, or Z, we improve engagement, we enhance engagement. It's just not true. And the reason being is because the data is so limited.
And that's really interesting. I don't know, Bob, maybe if you'd like to respond to this on this skepticism around big data in driving decision making. How do you feel about Wayne's opinion?
No, I think it's a matter of I don't want to say perspective, but the challenge in most of the countries that we work in is that there is data poverty. There is the challenge of many different systems that are siloed, lack of data interoperability, and a system in which the capacity is not there to most effectively use the data in real time. So you have census data that's being collected once a year, that's being, in many times in paper format, entered into an access database, and then you produce kind of your census report 9 months later, and it's not actionable. There's no feedback to the school level. So this is kind of the level of data that we're working at. So if we can increase that access to data a bit, it could have large impacts on just understanding simple things like how many students you have in your schools, how many teachers you have, where the teachers are, what their background is. So we're not at the big data level. When I talk about kind of be data driven, it is focusing on some of the very nuts and bolts, simple aspects and the challenges around being able to kind of aggregate and use data more effectively. There's also the issue of in some cases, collecting too much data, not asking the right questions, of really kind of interrogating what you really want to know about your system and focusing on those very specific data points. So it's a huge challenge in all of the countries that we work with. But beyond that, there are opportunities that many countries are looking at to use data for early warning systems, for example, to be able to have some data on at-risk students of dropping out. Which is a huge challenge. The other example that is promising is teaching at the right level. So many of the students are in grade 7th math, but only have a grade 4 knowledge. So again, can technology be used at the learning level to more effectively support those students to get up to grade level, for instance, in math? And there's been some promising studies there. So these are some of the areas that we're looking at the use of data, but it's at a very basic level to get the basic information about how your system is functioning.
And to keep with that, so it's sometimes difficult to talk about technology bridging the gap when 40% of the population in the world does not have access to internet, for example. So is technology, really the solution to bridge the gap? Is it just part of it? And also, what does this mean for a 12-year-old schoolgirl in Uganda, and what does this mean for a 6-year-old in Brazil, right? So how does this affect the day-to-day lives of students and teachers and parents, right? And Bob, maybe you can continue there.
Yeah, no. So we did an effectiveness study during COVID, and it definitely exposed this new access issue. So there has been an access issue with regard to students being able to get access to education from home, and looking at old technologies as well. So many countries have looked at use of radio, television, and combining that also with mobile and internet, and with the idea of building in this kind of human interaction, which is lacking in many of the traditional radio and TV programs. I think the other lesson is around kind of the gap in skills, that this has kind of exposed kind of a new set of skills that teachers require, not just the digital skills, but digital pedagogical skills, how to effectively teach in an online environment, as well as engaging and interacting with parents. And I think one of the other challenges that came out was just burnout too. I mean, I think there's no substitution for face-to-face. There's no substitution for human engagement. But lack of being able to do that, there are ways in which to think about kind of a hybrid model that really emphasizes the human connections and the human engagement in a system. So let me stop there.
Wayne, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, the point that Bob made about the different technologies, technology is a big word and it covers an awful lot. And as Bob pointed out, during the pandemic, probably the technology that was used the most was radio, followed closely by TV. And actually, the internet in many countries was a very poor third. And the tools that use, the highest level of technology, such as the AI tools, they were used very, very little, and not really changed a great deal from before the COVID period. They weren't developed in any particular sense for that. So I think that the problem is when we think about those young people in the countries you mentioned, how can we help? And a lot of the answers that people are giving are, well, we can use AI and data and pull this together and we can do amazing things. And there's actually been very little evidence of that. There's evidence of, very small things happening that are quite interesting. There's tools that use AI. They are established in an urban setting. They connect to the internet, they update, etc. And then they're taken into a rural setting where they no longer have internet access, but they function as if they did. And then when it's returned to the city again, it updates, etc. So there are possibilities like that. But the reality is that thinking that the problems that we have in those countries, and it's not just the less developed countries, in some rural areas in the more developed countries can fit this as well. If we think that we put the technology in and it's going to solve things, then I think it's just not going to work. The focus has got to be on the problems rather than the symptoms of the problems. So the symptoms, in a sense, are that young people are not receiving the education they deserve. But the problem is that very often it's because that the teachers in those areas are not well qualified, not well trained, not very experienced. And putting in the technology, we put in an AI tool into that, it means that that cohort of young people hopefully will benefit from those tools, which is fantastic. But it doesn't solve the real problem. And so we're going to need technology for the next cohort and the next cohort. And they're not dealing with this, the fact that the lack of the human expertise in the classroom. So rather than thinking when there is a problem like that, we can solve it just by putting tech in, we really ought to be thinking about how do we solve this? And what we should be doing in those kind of circumstances is working out how we can improve and enhance the qualifications, the experience, the expertise of those humans, teachers in those classrooms. Now, one of the ways in which that could happen is if we had AI-driven tools to help in that process. So, for example, there's an experiment connecting farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's using an AI-backed tool that allows small farmers to connect with other people, other farmers, so they can share experiences, talk about the market, etc., etc. It's a brilliant thing. But why don't we have something like that for teachers? So that a teacher, inexperienced teacher in one rural setting can speak with teachers in other rural settings and with experts in the cities. So we could use AI to help develop those teachers. And yet in the research area, there's virtually no research into how do we use AI to support teachers directly. It's all about how do we use AI to essentially do teacher functions, which inevitably has the possible outcome of replacing teachers. Now, that's never one's intention, nobody's intention to do that, but it's a possible consequence. So we've got to be clear about what we mean about the technology. We've got to be clear about what the problem we're trying to solve and not just pick off the symptom, but go to the heart of the problem and try and develop technologies that can help us support that and deal with that. For me, that's the longer term way of dealing with these things.
Exactly. And you both mentioned the importance of the human connection, right? So we all know that it takes a tribe to raise a child, but what does a tribe look like in this digital age? And can technology replace the full ecosystem in a child's life? Bob.
No, I'm just to build off of Wayne's last point on teachers, that I think the most effective use of technology is, again, building these human connections, of supporting teachers, for instance, through coaching at a distance, where there's some good examples of the efficacy of this tool, or the proliferation of WhatsApp, just to create networks to kind of share ideas, to reduce isolation in many cases that teachers were feeling. There's kind of an interesting example in Israel of kind of an app to find a scientist to bring into the classroom. So again, the idea of kind of enhancing these human connections and the ability of technology, to answer your question, to kind of expand the opportunities for teachers to tap into additional networks, additional expertise, additional content, so that you move away from the model that they need to be kind of the sole source of knowledge and information in a classroom to deliver to 30, 40 students. To being able to look at ways in which technology can support them to do different functions, to can help them to work in teams, to can put them in touch with a mentor, to help connect them with other sources of knowledge and information, to help them to better use, again, data to kind of understand, where are maybe the gaps in their students' knowledge, and be able to gauge more effectively with students and parents. So I think the key element that technology can provide here in terms of the tribe are the connections that weren't possible before. And that's also a cultural change. And this is kind of easier said than done, because there are, people get used to doing things in a certain way, and a lot of this requires kind of change management and convincing that this is a superior way to engage in education and learning. There's one project that we're working on in Turkey that is very explicit about the role of the teacher as an innovator, of working kind of with a broader ecosystem of solution providers, of kind of private sector content and application developers, to identify themselves, the teachers, what are the problems in the classroom, to engage with those tools, to test them in the classroom, to evaluate them, and then to determine whether indeed they're solving their educational problem. So marrying kind of those two cultures of education at the teacher level and solution providers, I think, is an important aspect of kind of expanding this tribe.
Absolutely. So as we need to wrap up, I'd love just to do a final, very quick round. what in one word or half a sentence, what would be your one recommendation or ask for policymakers in education? Wayne.
I think that the thing that I would ask them to focus on is to not get seduced by the exciting hyperbole that we're hearing about all the time. There are tools out there that can be very effective, but I think policymakers really ought to take things a little bit more carefully, and need to engage or encourage and fund the kind of research so that we're not just building tools that automate what I think of as poor pedagogic practices, but actually can start addressing some of the issues that Bob's been talking about. I think it's possible, but it's very challenging for policymakers not to get seduced. And while I value the role of the private sector, I do worry when the big tech companies are becoming so dominant. I don't know about you, but I do not want Facebook teaching our children, but that's what Facebook are doing. So I think, don't get seduced by the technology and look into things more carefully and invest in the research.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, on my side, I would go back to our first principle: ask why. That it's critical that any policymaker really interrogate why they're making this investment and exactly what is the change that they want to see in their system, in the classroom, in the engagement, the human connection between the student and the teacher and the parent, the student, the teacher, the parent, and the community.
Thank you so much. So we've reached an end. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I wish it could be longer, but we'll let you go now. Thank you, Wayne Holmes and Bob Hawkins, for joining us.
Thanks. It's been fantastic chatting with you today.